So the problems with the beta test next. The pictures, again, were culturally biased, which you wouldn't think they could be, but they definitely were. Too specific to American culture, or in particular, too specific to kind of white American culture, and would have been extremely difficult to complete if participants had no knowledge of some of the items. So the instructions, shockingly, were written in English. This is for the people who can't read and write, and the instructions were written in English in 3 of the 7 parts. The instructions were in English, and then in 3 of the 7 parts, the answers had to be given in writing, yet this was a test for literates who'd never held a pencil before. So if you can imagine me giving you a test in Chinese, and you've never spoken or written Chinese, you're not going to do very well on the test, are you? So these examples, a couple of examples, like some of you probably can't tell what's wrong with that, but it is a gramophone. Now, again, if you're living in a slum in New York, are you going to know what a gramophone looks like? No, there's no TV. You don't see these things. You don't watch Wimbledon on the telly in 1912 and 1918 to know that the net is missing on that. Unless you go down to the tennis club every week, you're not going to do so well on that. If you've never seen a pocket knife, you don't know what's missing, you'd probably be able to spot that one. But bowling, I mean, it is extremely difficult. The filament of a light switch, not everybody had electricity in 1912 and 1914, 1917. So, crazy. A stamp, again, you don't usually use the mail service for a lot of people back in 1917. So, unless you're rich, you're not going to, unless you're a rich white person, or unless at least you are middle class white, you're not necessarily going to know about any of these things. So, there's also criticisms of the administration of how the tests were carried out. Recruits who were illiterate should have been immediately assigned to the beta test, or given if they failed the alpha test, but this only happened in some camps. So some of them, where it was too busy, the beta test, they just said, can you read or write? No, well, the beta test's too busy, so crack on with the written test. Now, cracking on with a written test when you can't read or write is only going to result in one thing. You're not going to do so well. So, scoring next to nothing. In fact, the levels of literacy amongst Americans, especially black Americans, were much lower than Yerkes anticipated, and this confounded the problems further. So it confounded the problems because the Qs got much greater for the beta test, and that led to the artificial lowering of standards by the administrators to reallocate more men to the alpha test. In some camps, the minimum level of schooling was sufficient, so if they'd ever attended any school, then they were sent to the alpha test. Besides these inconsistencies in administration, further problems arose with men, especially black men, who failed the alpha test, were not being allowed to resit the beta test, so they weren't allowed to go and, that's what was supposed to happen, to go and have a go at the beta test. Only 1/5 of those who failed the beta test were allowed to take the individual examinations, and all of them should have been, so 4/5 of the people who weren't doing the beta test were sent for individual examinations. So even if we took these assessments to be good, even by his own standards, they weren't carried out in any reliable way, and huge problems there. The paper-based tests took less than 1 hour to complete and were individually undertaken in supervised group, often in rushed, intimidating conditions. So they needed to take less than an hour, but sometimes it would have taken longer, but they were just rushed in there, get on with it. Imagine an army-type scenario with army officers who probably didn't care so much about the goodness of this research. Remember, there's 1.5 million participants here. It's not Yerkes who sat making sure this all goes as according to plan. It was difficult to complete the test in the time allowed, but they weren't warned of this. So they were just said, right, off you go, page 1. But they weren't told, unless you really get a move on with these questions, you're not going to finish them in an hour. So if you took your time over the first few questions, you might only actually answer a few questions, and you're obviously going to fail the test. Gould argues that most of the test content relied heavily on cultural knowledge and access to formal schooling, which meant the tests were more likely to be assessing environmental influences rather than natural ability. So they were, according to Gould, measuring cultural bias and educational bias, not natural ability, which was the exact opposite of what Yerkes was intending to measure. So back to the conclusions again. The key thing is, and this is to remember for all IQ tests, but this is a perfect example of it, they do not measure innate intelligence. They are often unreliably carried out. IQ tests don't provide valid results, may not provide valid results. They often do not provide valid results. Are you measuring intelligence? Well, first of all, IQ as a concept is defined differently by lots of different researchers. What IQ is, how useful it is, that's defined differently and isn't really agreed upon widely. So how can you be producing a test that measures IQ when a lot of people disagree on the importance of and what actually is IQ? Inappropriate, poorly administered IQ tests can have tragic consequences, and that's the key thing here, and that's the thing that the reason why this study is great is because it shows, Gould shows, how being too hell-bent on being scientific, how producing something that you claim to be absolutely scientific just because you have a large sample can result in people misusing your research. It isn't Yerkes who is creating the 1924 Immigration Restriction Act. It is the senators and it is the congressmen in Washington who are carrying out that and using this science, in inverted commas, as a reason to have the 1924 Immigration Restriction Act. So there we go. Thank you very much for listening, and good luck with it.